Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Very warm welcome to this evening, very hot evening. And I'm delighted to have Ravi Agrawal once again. He has been so kind, generous to come over every year to share his thoughts and ideas. Everybody knows him, but still I will just read out a few lines by way of introduction to those who might have missed out. Ravi is a graduate from Harvard University. He's editor-chief Foreign Policy magazine. He also hosts the magazine's flagship video show and podcast, FB Live, interviewing world leaders and policymakers. He has spent 11 years at the CNN in London, New York, New Delhi. He served as CNN New Delhi bureau chief and was the senior producer for Jakarta GPS. He has received 3 Emmy nominations for his television production work. His columns at Foreign Policy were also nominated for National Magazine Award. His book, India Connected, How the Smartphone is Transforming the World's Largest Democracy, has received rave reviews internationally. Ravi, I hold you in high esteem for your incisive analysis, uncluttered understanding, and objective balance and dispassionate assessment, which is a rare thing in today's polarized world, including media and academia. I see my friend Kumar has joined from Jaipur. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I will start off Ravi straight away so that we will save time. My first question is the world today safer, more stable, economically more robust, and more peaceful than it was in January 2025? If not, why not? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Kumar. I also just want to say thank you to everyone for joining. I hold Ambassador Kumar in high esteem, and also the groups that he is able to convene all the time. So a short answer to your question, no. I think the world is not safer. It is not more stable. In fact, it is far more unstable, far more volatile, far more dangerous, with fewer safeguards, with fewer rules and norms and systems that are working. The system itself seems to be caving inwards, which means that there's no recourse for countries that feel they've been, they've faced wrongdoing, or if they're unhappy that another country is not following the rules, they have no recourse. The UN is not really functioning as it should. So in every respect, in your question, I think the answer would be no. We're worse off today than we were 4 years, 5 years, 20 years, 40 years ago. And the last time things were this unstable would have been before World War II.
Okay, so then how would you describe today's world? Multipolar, bipolar, unipolar, multi-aligned. Sachi Tharoor says he coined the phrase multi-alignment, which Jaishankar also adopted later. Later, or world adrift. The former NSA Susanka Mena says world adrift. How would you describe in very short?
I think calling us a world adrift is a fair assessment of where we are and where we might be headed. Look, we had the unipolar era of the last several decades. China's rise, I think, has brought us into a bipolar era where you have clearly 2 superpowers and they are ordering the world around them based on their being outsized in terms of the economy, their militaries, and their innovation. While we're currently still in a bipolar moment, to follow on from my previous answer, what is clear to me is that the system itself, the system that the United States largely backed and helped write, and what I'm describing here is the rules-based liberal international order after 1945, with the imprimatur of all of the Bretton Woods institutions, the UN, obviously the World Bank and the IMF. That whole system that was underpinning global order. And by the way, I'm not saying it was flawless. It was actually full of flaws, but it was the best we had. That system now seems to be falling apart, in large part because the United States itself is destroying the system that it built. And the United States, quite specifically under President Trump in his second term, no longer feels that the system is serving itself. And broadly, a lot of Americans also no longer believe that the system serves them. So you have this weird circumstance where, people like me, analysts like me, and frankly, much of the world would have said that the basic system, the basic rules-based order was serving us well, flawed as it was. But Americans no longer seem to think so. Weirdly, the only people who now speak up for the rules-based system are the Chinese, routinely defending it in international fora. Whereas for the rest of the world, especially middle powers, smaller countries, they're left asking, what about us? Who's going to advocate for us if you can have a Russia attack Ukraine, you can have an Israel attack Iran, and there are no consequences for any country when you break, very clear rules in international law. I mean, the United States, even now, outside of the war in Iran, I'll remind all of your attendees, is routinely killing people in the Caribbean. The gunboat violence. It may yet try to invade Cuba later this year. And this is a continual flouting of rules. All of that suggests to me we're entering a period of some sort of anarchy, some sort of interregnum between whatever new order emerges next, whether it's a China-led order or a plurilateral order or a multilateral system. We don't know.
But in this chaotic world which you are describing, what can the global south and so-called multi-land world do? Whether Ukraine, whether Gaza, whether Iran, Israel, USA conflict, they remain just like bystanders, helpless. Is it because they don't have moral courage or they don't have the political, military, economic heft to really propose any kind of restraint on these power which are violating international laws?
I don't think we can say they don't have moral courage. I think there are enough examples of moral courage from leaders of smaller countries. I mean, you think of someone like Mia Motley in Barbados, who, with great clarity speaks about the climate crisis and what needs to be done. You think of someone like the leaders of Singapore, who have been very clear that they care about the maritime law and freedom of navigation in the seas is very important to them because of the concept, not just because of the Iran war and what we're seeing in the Strait of Hormuz. So I think leaders do speak up with courage. The question is, who is listening and what kind of system is backing up their words? The other issue is that, look, we have in President Trump right now a leader who is so disruptive, so noisy, who gets all the headlines, who sucks all the oxygen in the room, and then who is masterful at deflecting and leading us to the next crisis, manufactured by himself often, who is very good at deflection and diversion. And there's every chance that now that there is an MOU in the Iran deal, that there will be no phase two. I mean, Trump is, if you look at what he does, there's never a phase two. There's no phase two in Gaza. There's no phase two in Venezuela. We're in a moment where, frankly, all of us are shell shocked. All of us are stunned that the news cycle is moving so fast, that people's attention is being diverted as quickly as it is. So I think that's where we are, and I would like to be a little bit more lenient on the leaders of the global South because they were never meant to deal with such a disruptive United States. That was not on the menu over the last 50, 60 years, not to this degree. And again, I don't want to suggest that America's done nothing wrong. It has in the past done a lot of things that I think were objectionable. But this is of a whole other level in the last couple of years, at least. I think the key thing that the countries of the global South need to realize is the more they can band together and speak with one voice, the more powerful they will be. And we're at a moment where the world and the world's media are looking for examples of alternatives to Trump, of new coalitions, new groups. There's a reason why Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, in his speech at Davos earlier this year, there's a reason why that cut through the way it did, because there's such a clamoring for some sort of guidance for how to navigate Trump world.
Thank you. It's very well described how things are, and also Mark Kenny's statement has really generated so much resonance. But fact is, who will lead these middle powers? Because any group need a leadership. There has to be a leader. In middle power, I don't know who could be the leader.
Yeah, so I was there for that speech in Davos at the start of the year, and the main question in my mind wasn't so much who leads the middle powers, it was what about everyone else? So let's say there are maybe plus or minus a few 10 middle powers on the planet. What happens to the other 175, 85 countries that do not qualify as middle powers? Who speaks for them? What happens to those countries? And he didn't really have a guideline for that. And so I found his diagnosis of the global state of affairs to be quite accurate, in that he wasn't looking back at the history of the rules-based order with too much nostalgia. He was willing to understand its flaws and its problems. And even so, he said, this is the thing that we should have improved and preserved. I liked all of that. I was less sure about his solution to his diagnosis that middle powers need to take the lead. I think they need to be part of the solution, but by no means, I think if you are a smaller country in the global south, let's say you are Sri Lanka, or Somalia. I'm not sure in this climate you would trust the bigger middle powers, Indonesia, India, Nigeria, Canada. I'm not sure you trust them all to look out for you. So we need something that is much more inclusive than just middle powers. And I think that is a conversation that is ongoing. I think the G20 actually has emerged as a much more inclusive body of late, especially now that it incorporates the African Union as well, which means that it is truly becoming the body of the global south.
You talked about G20, and you know the next summit G20 will take place in USA, and USA is not inviting South Africa. So, how Africa Union is included, but South Africa, the most powerful country in the country, will not be invited by the host.
Yeah, America is making a name for itself as a rogue superpower and a rogue host. If you look at the World Cup right now and how difficult it is for people from Haiti to come and watch their team play, let alone Iranians. If you look at the number of referees who haven't been able to come in, for example, there's a Somali referee who won Referee of the Year in Africa, was not able to come in and referee at the World Cup. Similarly, now with the G20, the United States is winning a reputation as a very poor host of all kinds of public events. And again, that is one more thing that many of us who care about America's role in the world are deeply disappointed by.
Okay, let us go back to US-Iran. At the end of 18-hour-long talks between American delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance and the Iranian delegation led by Speaker of the Parliament, Bagher Ghalibaf, in Geneva, the Qatari and Pakistani mediators claimed that they had made encouraging progress. The Swiss Foreign Ministry called it constructive progress. The Iranian Foreign Minister termed it major progress. J.D. Vance stated the talk had laid a good foundation and hopefully the final agreement can be reached in the next 60 days. Assuming that an agreement is reached, will it be significantly different from what was JCPO signed during Oman's presidency? So one commentator yesterday said that the stage where they reached in Geneva day for yesterday is the same stage where they reached in February before the bombs started raining on Tehran.
So I dispute the premise of your question. I would not assume that we will reach a deal in 60 days. There is every chance that they will kick the can down the road. In fact, if you are Iran right now, you've got everything you wanted. You've gotten the frozen funds up to $24 billion. You've got those released. So that will enrich immediately some of the richest, most powerful people in Iran. They have a potential investment of $300 billion, although it's unclear who puts money into that fund. Most importantly, the sanctions are being lifted on oil, on petrochemical products, on a range of other goods, which means Iran's economy can finally open up, which means that Iran can bring in a lot of things that it couldn't before. So Iran has won a lot of concessions to take us back to the status quo pre-war, which is, I am going to promise not to bomb you for crossing through an international waterway. That is the deal Iran has struck. It has completely hoodwinked the Trump administration. We are in a far worse off position than before because Iran has still some 70% of its ballistic missile capability, 90% of its mobile rocket launches along the Strait of Hormuz. It still now has the ability to shut down the Strait of Hormuz if it wanted to, because it's shown it can do it before. Insurance rates, by the way, will be very high for shipping in the months to come. So it has gotten a lot of the things it wanted without giving up much. Vance kept pointing out to a clause in the Memorandum of Understanding in which Iran says it reaffirms its commitment to not procure a nuclear weapon. Iran is a signatory of the NPT, of course. I mean, that's why Iran cleverly put in the word reaffirm, because they have already affirmed it in the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. So I think Iran has made a mockery of the United States in these talks. I think Iran, there's every chance that now that Iran has gotten what it wants, it knows that Trump does not want to go back to war. It may just drag this out because let's say you're reaching the 60-day deadline. Iranians are very famous in negotiations at the 11th hour to say, oh, one more thing, and then they'll prolong it. And that's why the JCPO negotiations went on for 2 years. So there's every chance that in 60 days, they'll kick the can down the road and we will be stuck in the phase one of this deal, just as we are in Gaza, just as we are in Venezuela. My own sense is that is the Trump way to, with great fanfare, to launch a phase one with no real plan to get to phase two, but you open up another arena, another theater of conflict, and that's where everyone focuses.
But US has got something. President Trump says now he can sell soybean to Iran. He could sell soybean to India or to China, but he says now our farmers will be very happy because Iran will buy soybean from US.
I think part of that is a new plan from Kushner to use the frozen Iranian assets to buy American goods. So, I mean, that's a clever little tactic there. But I'm sure the Iranians will have a comeback and they will figure out how to use that money for themselves. And remember, the Iranian regime now, weakened as it is, they've lost a lot of their top leaders. This is a more vengeful Iranian leadership. This is a leadership that is emboldened, more hardline, run by more people from the IRGC. So for all of them, I think they will be looking for ways to entrench themselves, to enrich themselves in the future. And there's every chance, if you spare just one moment for the fate of the Iranian people, who are struggling to get clean water. They're struggling to get electricity. This was the case before the war, but the war has made it worse. We must remember this is a regime that does not truly care about its people. This is a regime that cares only about survival, only about enriching itself and entrenching itself. And all of these deals will go first and foremost to entrenching themselves before any real tangible benefits reach the people.
Now let us turn to Gaza. One West Asian expert who spent more than 50 years in the region said repeatedly that Israel's main enemy is not Hamas, Hezbollah, but Bibi Netanyahu, who had no sense of history, nor does he have any vision for safeguarding long-term peace, prosperity, and well-being of Israeli people. If he had, he would have realized that Israeli military superiority over Arabs, including Palestinians, since 1948 has never been in doubt, but it has not ensured security for its citizens. So there is no military solution to the conflict. Geography demands that the Palestinian and Israeli live side by side peacefully within secure borders. Ultimately, there is no solution except the two-state solution. Netanyahu's strident opposition to two-state solution and persistent expansion of the Israeli settlements constitute the principal hurdle in resolution of overall Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Your comments?
Look, I think it's now well acknowledged that the very idea of a two-state solution was some sort of a canard. I think a lot of the people who were selling it, who were talking about it, they didn't truly believe it themselves. Um, and this is a process that has been doomed in large part, well, for many reasons, but a leader like Bibi Netanyahu, who has now been in power for the better part of 2 decades, really had no intention of allowing a two-state solution to move forward and has done every single thing he could do to make that destination less likely. I mean, from quote unquote changing the facts on the ground, an awful term that the Israelis use to indicate that they are taking over more territory with settlers. Uh, that is now an awful reality in the West Bank every day, where there is immense violence, and Palestinians living there are booted out of their homes, often beaten up. This does not get as much coverage in the international media, but that is the other big flashpoint in Israel and Palestine. It's no longer just Gaza. Um, and I think for Netanyahu, I think what has become increasingly clear is that he cares mostly about staying in power, and he needs to stay in power because once he's out, I think the likelihood of some sort of a corruption trial against him sticking is quite high. For all of you listening, there's a very good documentary called The BB Files. I highly recommend watching it, in which there is immense footage of Bibi testifying in his own corruption trial, and a lot of evidence pointing to corruption that did take place. And there is a fairly strong case against him that I think is the primary reason why he is so desperate to never be out of power. And I think for the Israeli people, they are, in a state of constant shock, and a state of constant war as well, where they feel that they are under siege from every country around them. They feel that they can never be safe. They feel that being in a constant state of militarization is the only way to protect themselves, and that Bibi is the man to do it. He is a person who doesn't care what the rest of the world thinks, who will do whatever it takes to keep them safe. And, they're in this death loop, in a sense, where even in the upcoming election, even the candidates that could potentially replace Netanyahu are also all center right. If you think of the IDF, former IDF general, who is beginning to surge in the polls, it's not like any of them have a dramatically different liberal course to chart for Israel. The reality that we all must get used to now is that most Israelis are in favor of the strategy that Netanyahu has pursued. Most Israelis were in favor of the war on Iran. Most of them, by the way, hate the current MOU, and they think that the United States has let them down. They're very angry at Trump. Most of them would have been very happy to continue bombing Lebanon, to root out Hezbollah, and to keep hitting Iran, whether or not the United States supported them. So that is the reality we are now living with in Israel, where an entire population now has dramatically shifted its views. And I'll just end by saying this. It's also worth keeping in mind that the mood in the United States has shifted. There is not only a shift in the population where, for the first time in polling history, more Americans sympathize with Palestinians than with Israelis. This is the first time we've ever seen this shift take place. Um, and the second is that if you look at the 18 to 34 age group, that shift is even more dramatic. So something like 41% of Americans sympathize with Palestinians versus 36% Israelis. If you look at the 18 to 34 age group, it is something like 60%, 20%. What that tells me is that we are looking at a massive generational shift. Generational shifts do not change overnight. They take a long time to build up. And if you look at what Vice President J.D. Vance said last week, he, when he was confronted with the question of Israel being unhappy with the MOU, he said, look, we're your only friend. You have no right to criticize us because no one else likes you. It's just us. We're your only friend. And I think what that means, the translation for me is the White House saying, we know how unpopular you are, but we also know what American people think, and we know how their views are shifting, and don't take our support for granted. So there's a big shift coming, I think, in US policy, not only with this Trump administration, but after Trump, we're very likely, Democrat or Republican, we're very likely to have a leader who is less tied to supporting Israel. Taking money from AIPAC, the Israel lobbying group in the United States, is increasingly seen as toxic. All of that, at some level, after these elections in Israel, will end up shifting Israel's policies, its self-perception, its understanding of how it defends itself. They've often talked about being an autarky, but in a region like that, with your size, with the tiny population that you have, autarky is not possible.
Ravi, I don't know. Israeli population at large, you are saying, supportive of Netanyahu's current policies. But this could be only short-lived consolation for them, because if you analyze, by killing 75,000 Palestinians in Gaza, Netanyahu has really given birth to more than 750,000 Palestinians in future who hate Israel. And the youngest was standing in queue just to get a loaf of bread and hungry and really digging the people from the rubble with bare hand. If they become 18, they will pick up a gun and try to put all the bullets. That means the hatred, the anger which he has increased is several times more. In the long run, he has really killed the hopes of future generation of Israeli to find some accommodation or some kind of reconciliation with Palestinians, because this feeling will be both sides.
Logically, you're right. But as I said, Netanyahu is not in a logical state of mind. He is in a survivalist state of mind. He must, first and foremost, get reelected, protect himself, make sure that the corruption trial doesn't stick, make sure that he has control of the judiciary, et cetera, et cetera. He is not thinking in the long-term best interests of his people. He's thinking in his own best interests in the short term. That's just where he is. I will say one more thing, though. What you're saying about the treatment of the Palestinians, the deaths, the moral horror that all of us feel around the world is real. There is, however, in Israel, a a dehumanization of the Palestinian people that I think has entered the public psyche to a degree that is worrying. And that is, in my understanding, the only way in which you can continue to support policies that lead to the mass starvation and killing and blockading, essentially an apartheid of so many people. Despite it being pointed out publicly, despite it, even Israeli rights groups like Beit Salem have called this a genocide. Despite all of this, for Israelis to look the other way suggests to me a syndrome where they feel so incredibly cornered and that battling for their safety is so paramount that they are willing to dehumanize the other, the regional other, whoever that may be. And I think that in some weird way allows them to sidestep this very logical question that you asked and think only about the short-term future.
Let's go back to Gaza. The much hyped, much publicized board of peace for Gaza. Is it going anywhere?
It's not.
$100 billion.
Short answer, it's going nowhere.
Because all the countries, the leaders came there, and Donald Trump appointed them there, and he was supposed to be CEO of this kind of setup, and he's not going anywhere.
Yeah, but it's not. I mean, all those leaders also made clear that for them to provide real funding and for development assistance to really go in, you need security. So the roadmap was very clear. First security, then development. We don't have security. More than 1,000 people have been killed in Gaza since the phase one deal. So as I said earlier, there often is no phase two. And, part of what's going on here is we are all so focused on the Iran war that we have not been able to think much about Gaza and the Board of Peace and the phase two there. And that's what I keep coming back to. I think Trump is a master of distraction. There's too much happening in too many global arenas all at once. And people either are unable to keep up or frankly, they're tuning out. I mean, there are a lot of people in the United States who no longer feel like they can even follow the news, that it's too overwhelming, it's too depressing, it's too frenetic, it's too crazy. And then linked to that, of course, is the fact that, we now have so many different forms of media on social and otherwise that our own attention spans aren't what they were. So Board of Peace seems very much like a January story that no one is really following right now. But again, I mean, part of it is down to security.
Okay, now let us turn to tariffs. In the aftermath of the judgment of the Supreme Court on the tariffs and the decision of the federal court about the higher fee for H-1B visa, do you think Trump's tariff regime launched in April 2025 achieved its objectives?
I mean, it certainly didn't achieve its objectives. I mean, Trump's objectives were crazy. His objective was to make sure that the United States had a trade surplus with every other country and that Americans weren't being quote unquote ripped off. Now, the very premise of his objective was false. So, and as we know, I mean, pure anyone with a basic understanding of economics will know that imposing tariffs in the way that Trump did was not going to solve any of these problems. And of course, trade is not a zero-sum game. So, the entire strategy was quite foolish. It's well known in the United States that Trump has no real ideological sort of things that underpin his career. But one of the things that does is his strange belief in tariffs as a tool and his strange obsession with trade surpluses going all the way back to the 1980s when he put an ad out in the New York Times complaining about Japan's trade surplus. So this is just one of those extremely strange quirks of the president. And when I've spoken to people in the administration off the record, they acknowledge that this is a strange quirk that they have to work around and deal with and navigate. And it just is what it is. And of course, Trump has found some people who have often enabled this kind of thinking, Robert Lighthizer, most famously among them in his first term. But now, of course, in his second term, Trump doesn't even need econ gurus who can help him enunciate these views because he is in an environment where he is less challenged. There are fewer people in the room who are going to criticize him or tell him not to follow his worst instincts. So that's why we had Liberation Day. Thank God for the bond markets, which I think put the fear of God in Donald Trump. And, the worst of the tariffs were averted. But in many senses, again, in part because of Trump's other outlandish threats, such as invading Greenland, he has now punched holes in some of America's most important alliances to the degree that, the tariff issue has kind of become a secondary one. And also, we shouldn't forget that much of this is pay to play. So, yes, there are some blanket tariffs on some countries and some industries, but the actual effective tariff rate has not risen by that much. And the reason is that it's full of loopholes. There are exemptions for different industries, for different companies. If you're Apple, for example, so no tariffs on iPhones. There are exemptions for various countries, sectors, so on and so forth. And this is a typical pay-to-play transactional game where if you know how to fight for an exemption, you will get an exemption. Whereas a random country that is a coastal country that produces bananas, for example, will not have the right to fight for such an exemption. And that is the strange world we're in. And to go back to the start of our conversation, that is why we're a world adrift. There is no rules-based mechanism to prevent the United States from doing what it is. The World Trade Organization, which frequently reminds us that some two-thirds of the world's trade is still being conducted under WTO terms, which is to say that the world is still following rules, is fine. But that ignores America. And the WTO has proven to be completely inept at being able to curb the United States at all or get it to follow its own rules.
A turn to Ukraine. Both Ukraine and Russia have been hitting each other ferociously. But at the same time, both seem to be interested in some kind of end to this conflict. So do you think Trump, who feels that he has already solved the Iran and US conflict, can he now turn attention to Ukraine and broker a deal?
I don't think so. I don't think Trump cares enough about that particular deal. And by the way, he has tried before. Much of the last year, he was trying to solve the Ukraine conflict until he realized that Putin himself does not want to solve it unless he solves it on his own terms. And Zelensky is no pushover. And Europe is finally beginning to step up. So I think Trump has lost some of his authority on the Ukraine issue. And this became very clear at the G7 last week, where Trump really changed his tune to get European countries to agree to the MOU, not that they were signatories, but to publicly praise it. To get them to do that, Trump has not renewed some of he had rescinded some of the sanctions on Russian oil, and he has not renewed those exemptions. So Russia will once again be sanctioned. And then second, I think Trump has once again suggested some willingness to providing Ukraine with Tomahawks, with more Patriot missile interceptors. And it remains to be seen whether he comes through on any of that. But Europe is fundamentally shifting. It is becoming a lot more defense focused. It is realizing that Ukraine is very much at the forefront of drone technology. Ukraine was, in fact, advising countries in the Middle East recently on how to navigate Iran's drones, which it has a lot of experience navigating. Ukraine has gotten far more adept at taking the fight to Russia, hitting many of its energy installations, its infrastructure, even as deep as Moscow. And we shouldn't forget that there are 5 times as many Russians dying in the battlefield than Ukrainians every month. And at some point, this will begin to catch up with Putin, if it isn't already. He is beginning to lose some of the war hawks in Russia. If you follow some of Russia's media, it's becoming increasingly clear that some of the most rabid supporters of the war from day one are beginning to lose interest in the war because, it is increasingly hard to deny that 4 years in, this war is not really helping Russia much. It is not gaining much territory, and the attacks on its own soil are becoming more and more real. I'll tell you one of the things that struck me as a real blow to Putin was on their Victory Day parade, I think last month. Zelensky offered permission to Putin to go ahead with the parade. And Putin had been so paranoid about a Ukrainian attack on the Red Square that he had disabled cell phone signals in that area in the days leading up to that. That's a huge humiliation for someone like Putin to tamp down a Victory Day celebration for someone who cares so much about history and his place in history and the showmanship of all of that. So my sense is that this war is very much in a sort of stalemate phase. And we're probably going to see some sort of push by the Europeans to try and help resolve it, and to take ownership of that situation without America, because they're increasingly realizing they don't necessarily need America. They need American arms, but they have the money to buy those arms.
Okay, let us turn to US-China relations. While subjecting several world leaders to his tongue lashing and harsh treatment in the Oval Office, on his trip to China, President Trump transformed himself into sober, restrained, and diplomatic person who told Xi Jinping how proud and honored he was to meet him and floated the idea of G2. Does this symbolize a mere tactical thought, or the US has grudgingly accepted China as a peer?
I think one fundamental thing that changed in the relationship was last year after Trump had imposed export controls and very high tariffs on China. China finally responded by weaponizing its monopoly on rare earths and critical minerals. And, just to remind your audience, China controls, some 70% of the supply chains for critical minerals. And it has an even greater share of the processing of those minerals because the processing is quite dirty and it entails some environmental degradation, which China is able to get away with, but most other countries are not. Now, China finally weaponized that dependence by saying, we're going to impose export controls on these critical minerals. We know you need them. We know that you can't run any of your companies without these minerals, but tough luck. And I think after that moment, there was a big change in how the United States approached China. Um, we're beginning to see again in the last week some new export controls on some Chinese companies, and China has retaliated on some American companies. So it could be that below the surface, they're testing each other to see what their appetite is for risk, what their appetite is for continued tit for tat export controls. But more broadly, it's clear to me that Trump has realized China has this massive advantage. The United States is focused now on pax silica and is trying to reorient some of the supply chains around critical minerals. But to be honest, that is a process that will take many years, a decade plus at least. So the United States doesn't have the cards. And so it's highly unlikely that uh, even Trump would try to be too adversarial with China at this point. I'll also just say one more thing in the defense domain. The United States has expended one third of its Tomahawk missiles, one third of its Patriot missiles, one third of its THAAD in all of this in Iran in the last 3 months. Uh, each of these missiles or interceptors, they take 4 years to build and they cost tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. China knows this. So China knows it's approaching a United States that is weaker than it has been in a while.
Okay, we have little time. One-liners, what we key organizer. What is the future of Quad or BRICS, Indo-Pacific?
BRICS, I think, has overexpanded to the point of irrelevance, in my opinion. I think the minute you add in Iran, and countries that are much smaller economies, it loses significance. But I think specifically, I found Iran to be very puzzling because, until a week ago, this was one of the most sanctioned countries on earth. And if you have any designs on building a BRICS currency or touting up BRICS trade or trade agreements, having on board a country that much of the West and the Middle East as well sees as a mortal enemy, even after this war, is, I think, a strange choice and makes, in my eyes, BRICS less enticing and perhaps more ideological as a grouping, and therefore just less attractive. Certainly, from an investment standpoint, from a geopolitical standpoint, you're not going to have middle powers in the West try to get too involved with BRICS in any shape or form. So, I think BRICS was more powerful in its original iteration than it is today. That's my own 2 cents. Quad, I remain bullish on the Quad, and just as I remain bullish on the the US-India relationship longer term, I think the fundamentals of the relationship are much stronger than the headlines let on. I think the people-to-people ties, the governmental ties outside of the friction at the very highest level from Trump, if you look at all of that, the signs are actually much more robust. And if you look at progress on tech cooperation, on defense cooperation, despite the trade talks that are going on, who knows how that turns out? I'm not an expert on that area. But I feel that in part because of my own positivity about the U.S.-India relationship, I wouldn't write off the Quad either.
Okay, now you all have seen, we have also seen in G7 sidelines, President Trump almost like unleashed the cloudburst of compliment from Prime Minister Modi. And you have heard a most beautiful person, he is smart, he is tough, he is negotiator. Now he says he admires only 2% of the world, Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi, because he has completed 12 years. Now, this is something happening behind, or this is just a personal bonami of President Trump doesn't really do this without any motive. What could be the reason behind this outburst of compliments?
I don't know. I think it puzzles all of us. But I disagree with you when you say he doesn't do things without a motive. I think oftentimes there is no motive at all. He changes his mind often. He flip-flops. He's flip-flopped on Russia recently. He's flip-flopped on China in his second term. He's been much more conciliatory towards Europe in the last week than he has been in the first half of his second term. So Trump is mercurial. He's contradictory. I think we should take his kind words about the prime minister and just leave it at that. It's not worth extrapolating too much from there. And I think, again, with Trump, the key thing is to focus on the policies, to focus on the substantive things that are actually happening on the ground and the core parts of any relationship that one can protect despite the turbulence at the top.
Trump has taken the US out of 66 international organizations, including the Paris Climate Change and the WHO. Now, do you think under Trump, US global leadership is lost its sheen and lost its prestige, which it was earlier?
Absolutely. To a massive degree. And again, I keep saying this, I don't want to have too rosy a view of America pre-Trump. America made a lot of mistakes. It was a flawed superpower. It was a flawed leader of the rules-based order. There's no doubt about that. But Trump has taken a wrecking ball to the system. He has destroyed large parts of the system to the point that future American leaders will really struggle to come at many of these issues with credibility. Countries will not take American lecturing very well. And America's lost much of the moral standing it had, in as much as it had some. So Trump has really jeopardized America's future in that sense. But for the world, he has, in many senses, destroyed the global architecture that underpinned world order since 1945. Now, some version of that architecture may be rebuilt, may survive, but this is the most significant blow to international organizations since those organizations were created.
While Balochistan, POK are on fire and our relations with Afghanistan have touched neither, Pakistan is basking in the rainbow of praise from the US, Iran, the Gulf countries for its military role in facilitating a deal between Iran and US. If the hard negotiated agreement does materialize and hold, who might get this year's Nobel Prize, Field Marshal Munir or President Trump?
Neither will get it. That's just not how the Nobel Prize Committee thinks. But since you raised Pakistan, I will say something that's been on my mind. I find it quite surprising that Pakistan gets so much credit in its negotiating role of late. And I'll tell you why. So first of all, why did Pakistan become the negotiator? And my own sense of this is a few reasons. One, it has really cultivated close relationships in the Trump administration, partly through lobbying, partly through literally bringing critical mineral rocks to the United States, nominating Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. We know all the things that Pakistan tried here. And of course, it has long-standing ties with Iran. But, Oman was negotiating previously. Qatar was negotiating previously. Basically, all the countries that could have negotiated and are better at negotiating and are seen by much of the world as neutral negotiators, Iran had started bombing them. So that's why they couldn't do the negotiating. That's basically what happened. And so we had no other option but Pakistan. So this idea that Pakistan emerged as a masterful negotiator, I think, is a bit of a misdirection. The truth is, there were no other negotiators left. Qatar was still trying to do stuff behind the scenes, but it was being attacked at that moment by the Iranians. So, hence the emergence of Pakistan. But I also don't think that we should overstate how Pakistan emerges from these talks. It is still a Muslim majority country with a nuclear bomb. It is still the country that housed bin Laden. It is still the country that has been responsible for a lot of terrorism in the region. And Americans, I don't think, will forget that. I think Americans have been critical, for example, even during the Islamabad process, that Iran was getting assistance from Pakistan. Lindsey Graham, for example, the senator, has been quite clear about that. So I would not overstate the glow that Pakistan gets from this, just as Qatar, which is a country that has really devoted itself to peace negotiations around the world, and is very, very good at it, just as Qatar too sometimes gets a bad rep. So I'm not expecting any Nobel Prizes for Munir or Trump.
Remaining few things, let me ask you a very light-hearted question. You know, Italian Prime Minister, how fond of seeing Prime Minister Modi. She always takes selfie with Modi. They had their melody, toffee, and chocolate. And now see the kind of respect between Donald Trump and the Italian Prime Minister. Now, who is right? She's claiming I never begged of any kind of selfie. And President Trump says no, she was begging for it.
We'll never know. This is a he said, she said case. I will say, though, it is not smart politics to say that someone else was begging for something. And it is very smart politics on her part to say that Italy never begs and I never beg. That statement that she made was, I think, a political masterpiece. Trump is not very popular in Italy, will be less so after that statement that he made. So Meloni's response, I think, was clever, was funny, and was politically masterful. And the fact that we're talking about it means that it will have staying power.
Okay, last question. You are sitting in New York. How is Mayor Mamdani doing?
I don't follow New York politics that closely. So the main things that he had run on, rent control, um, state-run groceries and the free buses. My understanding is that the only one of those three that he is truly moving towards is the buses. The other ones are more difficult to pull off. That's on the policy front. But I think rhetoric matters. Inspiring people matters. And if you look at great leaders and what unites great leaders, what makes them great, it's the ability to make people feel good. It's the ability to bring people together. And I think Zoran has become one of the most effective communicators of our era by being able to speak very clearly to people, by being able to not mince words, as he did just yesterday when he was talking about APAC, but by also being able to inspire people. When the New York Knicks, for example, the basketball team was winning in the finals, to really bring New Yorkers together to host watch parties across the city, to come out wearing a Knicks jersey and rally the people in a moment of great unity for New Yorkers. I think his political instincts are bar none. And I find that if Zoran is saying something today, then it is quite likely that other politicians will be saying it tomorrow, given his very astute reading of how people think and where they are at. Now, of course, the New York electorate is quite different from the national electorate. So what works in New York won't work nationally. And, if you are a leader in Ohio, I would not recommend following Zoran's politics. But all the same, his form of communication, his honesty, his lucidity, all of those, I think, are a model in modern political communication. And of course, his use of video is bar none. It's hard to think of any politician in the world who understands how to use video to tell a story, and he can only be Mira Nair's son.
Thank you very much, Ravi. You have been great. You are looking younger than last year, but much wiser
That's
than
not
last year. Thank you so much. I have given no break for you even to have your coffee. Have a nice day.
Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for listening. Always great to speak with you all.
Bye.